Good?
Yes, we can see everything.
Okay. It's a very short time today, so the presentation is just going to be pretty high level for Automox. If you have not heard of us before, Automox is an endpoint hardening or autonomous endpoint management solution. So typically for things like these very quick overviews of the tool, I like to talk about the industry problem as well as how we're actually fixing that problem, and then what our customers are saying so that you can relay that to your customers as resellers, MSSPs, right? Why people are getting excited about Automox. And so the problem, the really big problem that we're solving for are three things. If you think of technology, security tools, think of CrowdStrike, Rapid7, SentinelOne. They were all cloud native, right? They were all autonomous. They were all zero trust. But when you think about the tools that actually fix vulnerabilities, right? They are very legacy, had on-prem components, VPN dependent, and very little automation. Then you also look at the volume of vulnerabilities that are in the space. They're growing pretty exponentially. And the teams that we're talking with, at least, they have not grown, right, by quadruple, by 4 times. This number only accounts for what has been analyzed, and Rapid7 has kept track. There's over 30,000 unanalyzed CVEs. So it's a very big problem, on top of which attackers are, exploiting that problem faster and faster. They're doing it more effectively. They're having AI help them. And this is what we end up seeing. So this report is actually from Rapid7, who is one of our closest technology partners. But average organization is taking over 100 days to remediate vulnerabilities across their entire environment, right? Where attackers are taking under 2 days to do that. And so at Automox, right, our real goal with the autonomous endpoint management is our customers are hardening their critical infrastructure in 24 hours, right? And so when you look at the Automox platform as a whole, there's a few important things. We were the first cloud native tool to the space, right? So we had a lot of CrowdStrike, Tenable founders who saw the problem where they created very effective security tools, but there were no effective remediation tools. So Dmitry Alperovich still sits at the head of our board, right, kind of helping navigate this story and build the tool to combat that problem. And really what that means for your customers is we get that immediacy of success that you see with a cloud native tool, right? You are 0 to deployed to actually remediating vulnerabilities and automating in your environment. We were the first cross operating system tool. So the consolidation for customers, right? Making sure that they don't have a separate screen or tool for their Mac machines, their virtual machines, their servers, their workstations. We cover everything as a solution. And we'll talk about some of the integrations that we're also propelling. But this is the core functionality of the tool, right? The 3 pillars. Patching is a big part of that, right? Patching is an activity that many teams are still doing manually. They're spending hours a week patching, whether it's operating system or third party. It's still a large number of vulnerabilities, right, that we need to reduce is by patching the software or the operating system. But when it's not patchable, right, when there's a vulnerability that's not a patch, Automox is also the only tool today that'll consolidate that as easily as we do. So if you've talked to me in the past, you know that configuration for me is the biggest differentiator, right, with the Automox platform, because not only can we patch, but registry key edits, 0 days that you saw on that last screen where there's not a patch available, right? We're able to automate as well with what we call worklets, I'll talk about. And then consolidating general control as well, right? So seamless remote control, software deployment, making sure that your endpoints are compliant across the board. So that's kind of a very high level overview. I'll go into the 3 pillars as well, but I do want you all thinking about some of the problems that your customers are seeing in these categories, right? Patching first and foremost, right? I think the biggest problems are efficacy. We're using tools like SCCM or WSUS or Avanti or Manage Engine, and the efficacy isn't where we want it to be because of those dependencies, right? So when Automox takes out those dependencies as a cloud native tool, we consolidate, right, the largest distribution of Mac, Windows, Linux, as well as the largest list of third-party titles out of the box, right? And so that really does equal the hundreds of hours saved in terms of no longer manually downloading the package, no longer manually managing that piece of their environment, right? You tell us what makes you compliant. Maybe that's patching criticals in 24 hours, third-party applications like browsers or Office products or Adobe in 7 days, and then everything else in 30 days. That's what makes you compliant, your customers compliant. All they have to do is tell it, and the tool automates that for them. Then again, you have all of the unpatchable things. So there's a few key things to worklets here that I think are really interesting. First and foremost, right, we do have the ability for your customers to create their own automation or scripts at scale. It's just PowerShell or Bash. So if a team knows how to use PowerShell or Bash, or they want to leverage our natural language AI to create custom scripts, they can do that as well. But I think considering most of your customers are typically 100 to 500 users, this is my favorite piece, right? The worklet catalog, our engineering team has created over 350 use cases that span, configuration, maintenance tasks, security tasks, that they can basically run with a click of a button as part of their compliance. So I really like this example because when you're thinking of where is the value of worklets, right? This is one that I like to call out. And this is a 0-day example, right? Microsoft releases 0-day with Patch Tuesday. Our Automox team created the fix for that 0-day in under 50 minutes. And then, within 2 hours, we had hundreds of customers deploying that to hundreds of thousands of machines. And it's a really nice example to say, what does your remediation process typically look like, as a customer? And nobody is going to say 2 hours, right? It's that extra support, research, and the configuration to be able to run this at scale, where this ends up being so impactful for the customer. And this is sort of what it looks like, right? The catalog, the different use cases. So again, you have many different ways to now start running security configurations rather than using just maybe group policy, right? That doesn't work as well as they want it to work. You can simply say, hey, part of my compliance is not just patching, but it is getting rid of admin permissions that shouldn't be there. It's remediating log4j. It's removing Flash from my environment, not patching it, because Flash is giving me 30,000 vulnerabilities, right? All of these roll up into the health and security of someone's environment. It's just very difficult for them to do today, right? It's often individual products. And so being able to set that baseline, so Automox always says, hey, remove Flash if you ever see it. Make sure this person always has the right admin permission. Get rid of USB capabilities on the devices. Then you start to have a much more secure, proactive environment than having to reactively remediate that risk. And I'll show you some real examples as well. But this is really the overview of where that massive impact is coming from Automox. And I like to talk about this because right? I've worked at other security vendors, other tools, but this is really the first tool I've worked at or seen that has such large quantifiable value, right? I say quantifiable because as a reseller or as an MSSP, I think it's very important to be able to show immediate value to your customers and things like the immediacy, right? If you ask somebody how long it took them to set up their last patching or remediation tool, the answer we get is typically 6 months to 1 year, right? That's very different than seeing value within minutes. And so that's kind of a wow moment that you get to help them notice. Same thing with the risk reduction, right? We talked about why we're able to see that massive decrease in risk because we are automating not just patches, but also unpatchable vulnerabilities pretty instantly. And doing that all in a way that's very different, right, from the manual kind of labor-intensive process that they're very used to in the past. And so we are seeing from the reports we pull from joint customers, from our customers, over 90% lower total cost of administration, right? Because they're no longer spending 10 hours a week patching or configuring. They're no longer coming in on the weekends after Patch Tuesday, right, to have to manually execute everything rather than just observing. And so this has been, like I said, a really, really big piece for our partners to be able to quantify and to be able to differentiate. So I definitely recommend you leaning into this very hard when you think about how painful this process is for customers previously. I do want to talk, right, of course, as resellers and MSSPs, our relationship with other customers, right? But I would say the top half of this circle tends to be what I say like the warmest value add, right? If a customer has any of these tools, especially, right, the XDR type vulnerability manager, I like to say there's no warmer lead, right? Because now they know the vulnerabilities in the environment. They know the problem. I kind of joke, these guys almost do too good of a job telling you what's wrong in the environment, right? And so when you know what's wrong, fixing it and fixing it well becomes a much bigger priority, right? A much bigger priority. And we can come in and show value for how we fix vulnerabilities quicker than any other solution, right? And I mean that. Same thing with the SentinelOne and CrowdStrike, immediacy to deployment in the environment. And then, we still have the ability to integrate with ticketing solutions to close out that enterprise process. Really any type of data center, SIM, Power BI, Splunk, it doesn't matter. But I like to talk again about the top half of that circle, specifically Rapid7. If you are familiar with Rapid7, this screenshot will look pretty familiar to you, right? So this is a real screenshot from a customer with one device, right? It has a risk score of about 1 million, which is something we see very often. And it's not for lack of trying, right? But over weeks, they were really not able to do much about that risk. And the reason I love this so much is because one day they put Automox in place and their risk reduces 93% on that one device. And so when I talk about quantifiable value, I think it's very rare to be able to show such a drastic increase in value that this tool is having. And then the point here being, right, rather than taking this risk and trying to react to it, what we do with Rapid7 is we understand what is the biggest risk you have. In this case, this customer had a lot of third-party applications they weren't updating, right? Then on top of that, they had Log4j still in the environment. They had Flash in the environment. And by creating about 6 policies, that's it, to update third parties, critical OS patches, remediate Log4j, and uninstall Flash, kind of why I like those examples, it reduced their risk this much, right? 95 or 93% for these guys on that one device. And so, that proactive story is now, I keep my risk at this baseline. Automox is going to always enforce this for me because that's what I told it, right? I told it this is what makes me compliant. And so now what your teams have the ability to do is focus on, the 7%. You're not going to be able to automate everything, of course, but where do we actually need to focus our time to harden the infrastructure rather than just, again, this risk that's really unmanageable. So it's part of why, like I said, we have such good partnerships with the vulnerability scanners, specifically Rapid7, and the integration I can talk to a little bit. So we already mentioned, right, old way is very reactive. Take a list of all the vulnerabilities, then try to remediate. What we're doing with Rapid7 is automatically pulling in vulnerabilities every 24 hours. So that way we have a way to daily sync every patchable vulnerability they're seeing, every unpatchable vulnerability they're seeing, and any gap control with devices. So devices that we don't have Automox on. And because of that, right, we're able to create the policies to get this type of a result, but also have an immediate sync in Automox to remediate what Rapid7 is seeing on a case-by-case basis as well. So anything that's not automated down the line, right, I go ahead and I'm able to pull those vulnerabilities in and remediate them in the console. And I included this, it's a lot of words, but I did want to send you the document after so you can review everything we talked about. This again is really just understanding that you're in a position, right, to have to provide value to your customers, your your customers. And in this way, like we saw in that example, we just look at the risk, we look at the time that they're using and those SLAs, and we're able to create very, very tailored business executive briefings of the actual of the actual value that Automox is adding. So I included an example of that in here. And I also linked a demo into this slide, but I know we're supposed to keep this to about 20 minutes. So obviously happy to answer any questions, send you all the documentation, but hopefully this gives you a good, just overview of the problem we're solving for, how we're solving it, and the impact, right, that it's going to have on your customers.